far above the forests of southern Siberia, in a cave that had already held the breath and footsteps of countless winters. Archaeologists were working through layers of earth so old they barely seemed connected to the modern world at all. Denisova Cave did not look like the sort of place that might alter the human story. It was stone, silence, dust, cold air, and the slow patience of excavation. What the researchers expected to find there were traces that fit into a familiar pattern: tools, animal bones, perhaps fragments left by Neanderthals, perhaps signs of early modern humans passing through the region at different times. Ancient caves often give up their past in pieces, and those pieces usually enter debates that have already been going on for years. Yet every so often, something much smaller than expected appears in the ground and refuses to stay small. A fragment of bone, a broken tooth, a fingertip no bigger than a child's marble can begin to disturb a framework that once looked secure. In this cave, beneath layers laid down over tens of thousands of years, scientists found remains that seemed too slight to carry such weight. At first glance, they did not announce themselves with grandeur. They did not say that an entire branch of humanity had been missing from the story. They did not say that the family tree of our species had been drawn with too much confidence. They simply waited in the earth, silent and damaged, until modern hands lifted them into the light, and modern methods began asking questions that older forms of archaeology could never ask. The strangeness of the discovery was not only in what the bone was, it was also in what it should not have been. There were already names for the major human groups thought to have occupied Ice Age Eurasia. There were already accepted models, already categories repeated in textbooks, already familiar arguments about where Neanderthals ended and modern humans began. This fragment did not arrive with its own label. It arrived as a problem, and problems of that kind are often the ones that change everything. Before we settle into the cave and the long trail of evidence, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy calm history like this, and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, along with the local time where you are. I always like knowing which quiet hour these stories are keeping company with, and it is a lovely thing to imagine minds in different corners of the world drifting through the same old mystery together. Denisova Cave had already earned respect among archaeologists before the most famous discoveries emerged from it. The site sits in the Altai Mountains, a region that forms a natural meeting ground between landscapes and peoples. Across long stretches of prehistory, this broad zone connected forests, grasslands, colder northern worlds, and routes stretching deeper into Asia. It was not an empty edge of civilization. It was a crossroads, though not in the modern sense of roads and signs and mapped borders. It was a place where weather, migration, hunting, shelter, and season all mattered. Any human group living in that region tens of thousands of years ago would have been shaped by severe conditions. Winters were hard. Resources changed with the climate. Animal herds shifted. Rivers, valleys, and sheltering rock mattered in ways city dwellers can hardly feel today. A cave there was more than a hole in stone. It could be a refuge, a lookout, a stopping place, a repeating point in a moving pattern of life. When archaeologists work in caves like this, they are not only finding objects, they are reading time as if it were stacked in layers of compressed memory. One layer may hold ash from an ancient fire. Another may hold flakes of worked stone. Another may preserve the bones of animals carried in by humans or predators. Some layers are disturbed by water, frost, burrowing creatures, or later visitors. Others remain almost untouched, holding their order for astonishing lengths of time. In that sense, excavation is not treasure hunting. It is closer to peeling back thin pieces of a world that no longer exists and asking how each surviving thing came to rest exactly where it did. That process is delicate, slow, and full of caution. The smallest mistake can disturb context, and context often matters more than the object itself. A bone without its layer, its neighbors, and its date can become almost mute. What made Denisova Cave especially powerful as a site was that it seemed to preserve evidence from more than one kind of human occupation over very long periods. That alone was enough to make it important. It suggested not a single population, not a single moment, but a changing human presence across deep time. Yet that richness also created a difficulty. If multiple human groups had used the cave across thousands of years, then every fragment found there had to be handled with care. Was a bone from a Neanderthal? From a modern human? From an animal brought in for food? From a later disturbance? Ancient caves invite bold stories, but the science depends on restraint. At first, the remains from Denisova did not march forward, waving a new name. They arrived as isolated pieces, and isolated pieces are dangerous because they tempt interpretation before evidence is ready. Still, even careful scientists feel a quiet excitement when a site begins yielding clues that do not settle into expectation. That excitement is not loud. It is more like a tightening of attention, the sense that the ground is offering something that will not fit where it should. For most of the history of paleoanthropology, human origins were reconstructed mainly from bones and tools. That may sound straightforward, but it never really was. Bones are often incomplete, distorted by pressure, broken by time, or scattered far from the rest of the skeleton. Tools may survive longer than flesh, but tools do not come with names attached. One sharp stone can tell us that someone planned, struck, shaped, used, and carried. It cannot always tell us exactly who that someone was. As a result, ancient humans were usually identified through physical features that seemed distinct enough to separate one population from another. A skull with one pattern of brow ridges, a jaw with certain proportions, a tooth of unusual size, a limb bone with a particular robustness. These became pieces in a broad attempt to classify human diversity across the past. That effort achieved a great deal, and yet it also carried built-in limitations. Ancient human populations were not arranged in tidy museum drawers waiting to be labeled. They changed over time. They migrated. They sometimes mixed. Some local populations kept older traits, while others changed more quickly. A fragment from one region might look confusing because it shared traits with more than one known group. Another might look strange simply because it came from an individual whose anatomy sat near the edge of natural variation. The deeper one goes into the past, the harder it becomes to pretend that every specimen belongs neatly to a clean category. Scientists knew this, of course, but the practical work of classification still required names, boxes, and models. By the late 20th century and into the early 21st, the broad picture for Eurasia seemed manageable, even if many details remained debated. Early modern humans, members of our own species, had spread out of Africa and into the wider world. Neanderthals had occupied much of Europe and parts of Western Asia for long stretches of time before disappearing. There were earlier human relatives farther back in time, but when people imagined the late Ice Age human world of Eurasia, they often pictured a stage shared mainly by those two recognizable groups. The story was already complex, yet it still felt limited enough to grasp. In that story, A cave in Siberia might hold traces of Neanderthals, or of modern humans, or signs of both at different times. That would have been important, but not shocking. The problem with this older picture was not that it was foolish. It was that it had been built with incomplete tools. Bones and artifacts could take researchers far, but only so far. If an ancient human population left few recognizable skeletons, or if its bones were too fragmentary to stand out clearly, it could remain hidden in plain sight. It might appear in collections as an oddity, a disputed specimen, a bone that looked just unfamiliar enough to be annoying, but not enough to found a new category. And if that hidden population had mixed with others, the confusion would only deepen. Features would blur. Borders between groups would look less like walls and more like shifting edges. The old framework did not collapse because scholars were careless. It stood because the evidence seemed to support it. What no one fully appreciated yet was how many missing people a framework can contain without knowing it. One of the remains from Denisova cave that became central to this story was so modest that, outside scientific circles, many people would have walked past it without a second glance. It was not the sort of magnificent fossil that fills display cases and commands a whole room. It did not possess the imposing drama of a complete skull staring out from deep time. Ancient human history is often imagined through those grand museum images: a face reconstructed in careful clay, a cranium under glass, a skeleton arranged with solemn lighting. The Denisova remains were different. They were fragmentary, almost frustratingly so. This is part of why the discovery feels so strange. Human history was not changed by a splendid fossil marching into view. It was changed by bits. That modesty matters, because it reveals something essential about science. Major revisions do not always begin with giant revelations that announce themselves at once. Sometimes they begin when somebody refuses to dismiss a small object simply because it is small. In an ancient cave, especially one used over huge spans of time, fragments are everywhere. Most belong to animals. Some belong to humans. Some cannot be identified immediately. Each must be examined, catalogued, compared. The work is not glamorous in the usual sense. It is patient, repetitive, and full of uncertainty. Yet in that very patience lies its power. The extraordinary often survives in disguised form. The remains associated with the Denisovan story included a finger bone, teeth, and later other fragments that opened deeper questions. There was also a skull fragment part of a larger effort to understand who these people were physically, not only genetically. The title of this script speaks of a skull that should not exist, and that phrase captures a real tension. The bone did exist, plainly enough. What should not have existed was the category it pointed toward. The past, according to the older map, did not seem to have room for another major human population in late Pleistocene Eurasia, especially one with such wide consequences. Yet the fragmentary evidence was beginning to suggest exactly that. At first, the remains did not instantly produce a whole new species in the scientific imagination. That is not how science usually works, and when it does, it often goes badly. Researchers tested, dated, compared, and doubted. A strange fossil must survive suspicion before it is allowed to carry a new idea. Could it belong to a known group? Could the context be misleading? Could the layer have been disturbed? Could its unusual features merely reflect individual variation? Those are not obstacles to discovery. They are part of the discipline that makes discovery trustworthy. Still, there are moments when caution itself begins to sharpen mystery. If a bone refuses every easy answer, then the refusal becomes evidence. The remains from Denisova cave were beginning to acquire that stubborn quality. They were not dramatic because scientists wanted drama. They were dramatic because they would not behave like familiar fossils. And this is where the story starts to turn. Until this point, all the tension could still have ended inside the old methods. A puzzling bone might remain puzzling. A fragment might be filed under uncertain classification and stay there for decades. That had happened many times before. But the early 21st century gave researchers something older generations never had: the chance to ask ancient bone a different kind of question. Not, "What do you look like?" but "Whose history do you carry inside you?" To ask that question of ancient remains once seemed almost impossible. DNA is fragile. Time breaks it apart. Heat, moisture, bacteria, chemical changes in bone, and simple age all work against its survival. Even when traces remain, they are damaged, incomplete, and terribly easy to contaminate with modern human DNA. An archaeologist's touch, a breath in the wrong place, a laboratory surface, a careless step in handling all of these can cloud the result. For years, the dream of reading genetic history directly from ancient bones was treated with skepticism because the technical challenges were so severe. How could researchers be sure they were reading the dead rather than themselves? How could tiny scraps of damaged genetic code be trusted enough to redraw the human past? The answer came gradually through new methods, cleaner laboratory practices, better sequencing technologies, and more sophisticated ways of recognizing authentic ancient DNA. Scientists learned to identify patterns of molecular damage typical of old genetic material. They developed controlled environments designed to reduce contamination. They compared results across teams and samples. What had once seemed speculative began turning into a revolution. Ancient DNA did not replace archaeology or anatomy, but it transformed them. It offered a new line of evidence, one capable of detecting relationships that bones alone might never reveal. When researchers extracted DNA from one of the Denisova remains, they were not simply hoping for a date. They were opening a line to ancestry itself. What came back was startling. The genetic sequence did not sit comfortably inside the expected categories. It was not modern human DNA. It was not Neanderthal DNA in the ordinary sense either. It pointed to a lineage related to Neanderthals, yet clearly separate from them, a sister group that had split from a common ancestor and followed its own path. This was not merely a local variation or a strange individual. It suggested a human population that had been missing from the accepted narrative. That moment matters because it did not just add one more fossil to the shelf. It changed the way absence itself was understood. A whole branch of humanity had not been recognized through a full skeleton, a famous skull, or a dramatic chain of visible fossils. It emerged first, through genetics. In other words, scientists learned that a major human population had been present in the past, even though the fossil record for it was astonishingly slight. That is one of the most humbling lessons in all of this. The human story was not complete enough to recognize all its own participants. The cave had been holding evidence of people whose bodies were largely lost to time, while their genetic identity remained recoverable in the tiniest surviving fragments. The first response from the scientific world was not simple acceptance. It was scrutiny, and rightly so. Extraordinary claims demand repeated testing. The sample had to be checked, the contamination risk considered, the sequence compared against known human and Neanderthal data. But as evidence accumulated, the picture held. Something real had appeared. Not a monster, not a mythical race, not a speculative phantom, but a genuine ancient human population that had once lived, moved, adapted, and interacted with others across Eurasia. It would come to be called the Denisovans, after the cave that guarded their remains. The name sounded almost too neat for something so disruptive, yet the disruption was real. What had looked like a missing category in the human story was beginning to solidify into fact. Even at this early stage, before the full implications had spread through textbooks and public imagination, the Denisovan discovery began changing the emotional shape of human history. The older picture had often been told like a sequence of replacements. One group rises, another disappears. One lineage moves in, another fades out. There was truth in that model, but the Denisovan evidence hinted at a world more crowded, more entangled, and less cleanly divided. If a major population could remain almost invisible in the fossil record, yet still stand genetically distinct, what else had been missed? How many ancient encounters had left traces too subtle for bones alone to reveal? And how certain could anyone be that the late Ice Age human world had been limited to the cast of characters already known? The skull fragment at the center of this title matters because skulls have long held a special place in the human imagination. Faces, heads, crania, these are the remains people turn toward when they want to picture identity. A skull feels personal in a way a finger bone does not. It suggests expression, thought, individuality, presence. Yet the great irony of Denisovan discovery is that the most decisive evidence did not come first from a face we could confidently reconstruct. It came from molecules hidden in bone. We knew them genetically before we knew them physically. That reversal unsettled more than one scientific habit. It suggested that the human family tree could no longer be built mainly by what the eye could sort into types. The eye had limits. Deep time had been playing a subtler game. This is why the phrase, "a skull that shouldn't exist," carries more than drama. It points toward a genuine scientific shock. The remains from Denisova Cave implied that ancient Eurasia was not simply the shared stage of modern humans and Neanderthals. There had been another branch, close enough to interbreed with related populations, distinct enough to stand apart, obscure enough to stay hidden, and significant enough to alter the history of our species once its DNA was read. The discovery did not erase Neanderthals or modern humans from the story. It made the whole story less tidy. It replaced a simpler map with a denser one. And yet the cave still keeps some of its silence. Even after the naming of Denisovans, many questions remained hanging in the cold air around those bones. What did they look like across the whole body? How wide was their range? How often did they meet other humans? What cultures, tools, and habits belonged to them? How long had they been part of the wider human world before vanishing as a distinct population? A cave can answer one question by creating 10 more. That is part of its power. It gives up a fragment, and the fragment opens a corridor. So for now we remain at the threshold. A cave in Siberia, a few damaged remains, a skull fragment that refuses the old order, and the first unmistakable sign that the human past was more populated than many scholars had imagined. Once that door was opened, the task was no longer simply to name the hidden people. It was to understand the world that had hidden them so well, and the older map of humanity that suddenly looked too small. Long before anyone gave the Denisovans a name, the ancient human past had already been arranged into a story that felt broad, serious, and largely stable. It was not a childish story or a careless one. It had been built slowly, through generations of excavation, comparison, argument, and revision. Fossils had been measured, dated, and debated. Stone tools had been sorted into traditions and industries. Cave layers had been read like damaged chapters from a very old archive. By the early 21st century, Specialists certainly knew that many questions remained unresolved, but the overall shape of late human prehistory across Eurasia seemed understandable enough to teach with confidence. Africa was the deep homeland of our species. Early modern humans had spread outward over time. Neanderthals had occupied much of Europe and Western Asia for a very long period. Their disappearance, and the role modern humans may have played in it, had become one of the great recurring questions in human evolution. There were older relatives farther back in time, but for the period closest to the age of Denisova cave, the stage seemed already cast. Two main human players stood in the foreground, us and the Neanderthals. That older picture matters because it helps explain why the Denisovan discovery landed with such force. Scientists did not wake one morning assuming a hidden branch of humanity must be waiting in Siberia. They worked within a framework that had earned its authority. Neanderthals were no longer seen as brutish caricatures, as they had too often been portrayed in older popular culture. They were recognized as intelligent, adaptable humans with complex behaviors, skilled hunting practices, and long histories across Eurasian landscapes. Modern humans, meanwhile, were understood as the lineage that would eventually spread across the entire planet. The major questions were about movement, timing, contact, and replacement. When did modern humans reach particular regions? How long did they overlap with Neanderthals? Did they compete directly? Did climate shifts push one group into crisis? Did cultural flexibility play a role? Those were large questions, but they still unfolded inside a map whose basic populations seemed known. There was also a comforting simplicity in the way that map could be drawn. One could imagine human evolution as a branching line, with older forms giving way to newer ones, occasional overlap at the edges, and some uncertainty about classification, but still a story that moved in a manageable direction. It was not entirely wrong. The trouble was that it encouraged people to picture the human past as cleaner than it had probably been. We like a family tree because trees make sense to the eye. A trunk divides, branches separate, and the pattern remains readable from a distance. Yet real populations do not always behave like lines on a diagram. They spread, divide, reconnect, shrink, survive in pockets, and meet again after long separation. They borrow, mix, and vanish unevenly. The old map of Eurasia was solid enough to guide research, but it may also have been too neat to notice how much traffic had once crossed its borders. To understand that older world, it helps to picture Eurasia not as one continuous human habitat, but as a vast patchwork of environments changing across time. The late Pleistocene world was not stable. Ice sheets expanded and retreated. Cold periods tightened their grip and then eased. Forests shifted, grasslands opened, rivers changed course, coastlines moved as sea levels rose or fell, and animals responded to all of it. Human beings, whichever group they belonged to, had to respond as well. A population living successfully in one period could face severe pressure in another. Routes that were open during one climatic phase could close during the next. Regions that seemed inviting could become harsh. Harsh places could also become corridors if conditions changed. The ancient human past was shaped not only by who existed, but by where food, shelter, water, and movement remained possible. Neanderthals had adapted to much of this world with remarkable endurance. They were not a brief experiment. They occupied enormous stretches of time, and their bodies reflected deep adaptation to the environments they inhabited. Their bones were often robust. Their faces and skulls showed patterns distinct enough that paleoanthropologists could usually recognize them, though not without debate over some specimens. Their tool traditions changed across time and place, but they were clearly capable hunters and problem solvers. For many years, the public image of Neanderthals had lagged far behind the evidence. They were once mocked as dim, clumsy, and almost animal-like. Research gradually corrected that view. Neanderthals cared for injured group members, used fire, made tools with skill, and survived in demanding settings for longer than many human societies have existed. In the old framework, they occupied the role of our nearest famous cousins, the obvious other people in the Ice Age world. Modern humans, by contrast, were understood through a different kind of expansion. The great story here was dispersal out of Africa, movement into new regions, and the eventual spread of Homo sapiens across nearly every habitable landscape on Earth. This process was not imagined as a single march. It involved waves, pauses, and complexities still argued over today. Yet by the time the public heard the broad story, it often sounded smooth. Modern humans emerged, moved outward, met older populations, and ultimately became the only surviving human lineage. That last fact is so familiar that it can hide how strange it really is. For much of our evolutionary past, we were not alone. The modern world, in which one human species covers the globe, is unusual. For long stretches of prehistory, the human story contained neighbors. The old picture of Eurasia, then, was already more interesting than the simplest schoolbook version. It included coexistence, it included overlap, it included cultural differences, local adaptation, and uneven timelines. Yet even that richer version still gave the impression that the list of major human players in late Eurasia was fairly short. The hidden assumption was not that every mystery had been solved, but that the main cast had been named. There could be puzzling specimens, disputed dates, and blurred boundaries. What did not seem likely was that a substantial population had escaped recognition almost entirely. Part of the reason the old framework seemed secure lies in how fossils had traditionally been used to define ancient humans. When a paleoanthropologist looks at a skull or a jaw, the task is not unlike reading a language with many missing letters. Shape matters. Proportion matters. Thickness, curvature, placement of certain landmarks, size of teeth, pattern of brow ridges, slope of the forehead, the structure of the inner ear. The dimensions of limb bones each can provide clues. A single trait rarely tells the whole story. Several together may suggest a population, an ancestry, or a relationship. Yet the fossil record is not a neat museum drawer filled with perfect samples. Most ancient human remains are damaged, partial, or worn by time. They come from different ages, different regions, different ecological settings, and sometimes from deposits whose contexts are not perfectly preserved. Scientists do careful work, but the evidence they receive is often incomplete before they ever touch it. This creates a persistent problem. If a fossil is distinctive enough, it can become the type specimen for a recognized group. If it is too incomplete, it may remain uncertain. If it shares features with several groups, it may trigger years of argument. A jaw from one cave may be claimed as modern human by some researchers, archaic human by others, and left suspended in uncertainty for decades. A skull fragment can look revealing in one paper and frustrating in the next. Classification, therefore, depends not only on anatomy itself, but on comparison, interpretation, and the range of specimens already known. In a sense, fossils are judged partly by what company they keep. If the scientific community already knows a broad range of Neanderthal features and modern human variation, a new specimen will often be placed somewhere relative to those patterns. That method achieved tremendous things. It built the field. It gave humanity its first serious map of deep ancestry. But it also had a blind spot. It worked best when a population left enough distinctive bones, in enough places, that scientists could recognize a pattern. A hidden lineage could slip past the eye, if its remains were too scarce, too broken, too regionally varied, or too easily confused with another group. This is especially true in parts of Asia, where the fossil record for some periods has been thinner, more scattered, or harder to interpret than in parts of Europe. Europe became central to much of the classic Neanderthal story because its fossil record was comparatively rich and had been studied intensively for a long time. Asia offered its own crucial discoveries, but the overall picture there often felt less settled. Distances were vast, sites were unevenly distributed, preservation conditions differed. Some finds were fragmentary, others were known, but difficult to place. That matters because the Denisovan story emerged not in the best understood heartland of ancient human fossils, but in a region where gaps still remained. An unrecognized population might survive longer in the shadows of such a record. A tooth too large and strange for expectation might be noted but not fully understood. A bone fragment might be catalogued without fanfare. The old framework did not collapse because scientists ignored Asia. It persisted because the visible evidence, interpreted through older tools, did not yet force anyone to imagine an additional branch of humanity with confidence. The missing people, if they existed, were hidden not by a lack of intelligence on the part of researchers, but by the ordinary limits of the fossil record itself. And those limits were severe. Bone is not guaranteed to survive. Most bodies vanish almost completely. Teeth survive more often than fragile cranial elements. Small bones can be lost, crushed, chewed, or scattered. Water can move them. Frost can crack them. Sediment can distort them. Carnivores can drag them away from where they were first deposited. Human groups can reuse a place over thousands of years, mixing traces from different times into layers that later require extraordinary care to separate. In that kind of world, the absence of evidence is always difficult to interpret. Does a missing population leave no fossils because it was never there? Or because its remains were not preserved, not found, or not recognized? This question sits under a great deal of paleoanthropology, and it haunted the older models more than many non-specialists realized. Imagine trying to reconstruct the population history of a continent using a handful of damaged photographs, most of them missing faces, many without dates, and none with names written on the back. That is still a simplification, but it gets close to the challenge. Researchers compare what they have, but what they have may represent only a tiny and distorted sample of the lives once lived. The fossil record does not preserve significance in proportion to significance. A widespread population may leave almost nothing. A local group may leave several well-preserved remains simply because geological luck favored one cave over another. Great movements of people can pass through time with hardly a skeletal trace. Human history in deep time is therefore full of silences, and older frameworks are often shaped by whichever individuals happen to survive in bone long enough to be found. This is why categories once seemed stronger than they really were. A robust set of Neanderthal remains from one part of Eurasia could create a clear image of Neanderthal anatomy. A growing record of early modern humans could do the same for our lineage, but between and around those clearer pictures, there were specimens that did not fit easily. Some were labeled archaic. Some were set aside as ambiguous. Some might later be reassigned. The field had long experience with uncertainty. What it had less experience with was the possibility that a major lineage might first reveal itself, not through an elegant anatomical pattern, but through genetics extracted from fragments too meager to inspire public awe on their own. Before that genetic revolution, scholars still built meaningful interpretations from what little they had. Tool assemblages, for example, provided one important kind of indirect evidence. Stone tools could suggest continuity or change. local traditions, or outside influence. They could show planning depth, resource use, and sometimes mobility. Yet tools, like bones, come with limits. Different populations can make similar tools. One group can adopt or imitate techniques from another. A single cave layer may hold evidence of occupation by humans whose biological identity is not obvious from artifacts alone. Archaeologists could therefore reconstruct behavior better than identity in many cases. They could say a population hunted, butchered, cut hides, worked wood, used fire, or processed plants. Naming exactly which human lineage performed those acts remained more difficult. So the old human world before Denisova was not a crude map drawn in ignorance. It was an intelligent map drawn with incomplete instruments. That distinction matters. When the Denisovan evidence arrived, it did not simply prove the past had been misunderstood. It showed that the tools available to earlier generations could only take the story so far. The map was incomplete because the record had withheld part of itself until new methods could hear what bone alone could not say. Another reason the older picture felt manageable was the power of narrative habit. Once a scientific model becomes widely taught, repeated, and built into public understanding, it begins to feel natural. Even specialists who know its weaknesses work inside its language. They ask questions in ways the model makes possible. They collect evidence for debates the model has already defined. They refine edges rather than replacing the whole shape. This is not stubbornness in a foolish sense. It is how knowledge usually advances. Most days in science are not days of revolution. They are days of careful adjustment. Measurements get more precise. Dates are corrected. A migration route is shifted by a few thousand years. A particular site becomes more or less important than once thought. The deeper structure remains. For late Eurasian prehistory, that deeper structure centered on known interactions between modern humans and Neanderthals. Did they overlap in the Levant? In Europe? For how long? Did one displace the other through competition? Through demographic advantage? Through climate resilience? Through sheer chance? These were real questions, and still important ones. But notice what the framework did. It concentrated attention on a relationship between the lineages already visible in the fossil record. If another population lingered beyond that relationship, especially farther east, it might not easily become the center of the story. It would appear, if at all, as a peripheral puzzle rather than a candidate for rewriting the map. This helps explain why Asia occupied an ambiguous place in older human evolution narratives. It was obviously crucial. No serious scholar could ignore it. It held evidence of early human dispersals, regional populations, and later expansions of modern humans. Yet the story told most often to broader audiences still leaned heavily westward, toward Europe and the famous Neanderthal sites that had shaped the field's imagination. Asia could feel like a frontier of questions rather than the settled core of the narrative. That made it fertile ground for surprise. A region filled with large distances, patchy records, and multiple migration routes is exactly where hidden complexity may linger longest. Even within that uncertainty, however, the expectation remained modest. Researchers might discover unusual local variants, better dates, or new mixtures of traits. They might push known populations farther east or earlier in time than once believed. The possibility that a major branch of humanity had survived without a proper place in the standard story felt far less likely. Hidden populations belonged more comfortably to the deeper past, where the record grows thinner and classification harder. But Denisova Cave belonged to a later and more familiar stretch of the human story, one close enough to the worlds of Neanderthals and early modern humans that the cast already seemed set. That is one reason the discovery felt so disruptive. It did not emerge from a time so remote that everything was uncertain. It emerged from a period people thought they understood reasonably well. And then there was the emotional force of names. Neanderthals were known not only as fossils but as characters in the public mind. They appeared in documentaries, museum halls, school books, and arguments about what makes us human. Modern humans, of course, were not just another category. They were us. To insert another substantial population into that already powerful pairing was to disturb more than a technical chart. It altered the emotional composition of prehistory. Suddenly, the human world of the late Ice Age looked less like a two-part dialogue and more like a crowded conversation from which at least one voice had been missing. There had been hints, of course, though they were difficult to recognize as hints at the time. Some fossil finds in Asia did not fit comfortably within familiar categories. Certain teeth seemed unusually large or oddly shaped. Some jaw fragments and skull pieces hinted at archaic features that did not line up neatly with classic Neanderthal or modern human expectations. Yet such hints are common in paleoanthropology. The record is full of awkward specimens. Most do not generate a new branch of the human family. Many are eventually interpreted within known variation or remain unresolved. A field cannot declare every strange bone to be evidence of a lost people. It has to live with ambiguity. Still, looking backward from the Denisovan discovery, one can see how the old world was already slightly frayed around the edges. The tidy map had loose threads. Asia, especially, contained specimens that seemed to point toward complexity beyond the simplest model. Scientists debated the classification of fossils from China, Siberia, and Southeast Asia. Some argued for regional continuity in certain traits. Others emphasized repeated migrations and replacements. Some stressed the importance of older lineages surviving longer than expected in isolated pockets. In hindsight, these arguments do not look like confusion alone. They look like a field sensing that the past was messier than its best-known diagrams suggested, even if it lacked the evidence to say exactly how. The Denisovan discovery would eventually give that intuition a new foundation. But before it did, the older world remained poised in a peculiar state, rich in data, yet still underexposed, confident in its main categories, yet uneasy around their borders, increasingly global in ambition, yet uneven in evidentiary strength. This is often what a scientific world looks like, just before a major correction. It does not feel broken. It feels workable. It may even feel more mature than ever. The contradiction is that maturity can reveal limits only after new methods open a door the old ones could not. There is something almost poetic in this. For centuries, the deep human past had been reconstructed from the visible endurance of matter: bone, stone, tooth, ash, and sediment. Then science learned to read another archive, one hidden inside the matter itself. The old world before Denisova was therefore the last stage of a mainly anatomical age of human origins. It was a powerful age, a necessary age, and it still remains indispensable. Yet it was also the age just before ancient DNA began revealing relationships invisible to shape alone. That transition matters because it changes how we should judge the older map. We should not mock it for failing to include a people it had no reliable way of naming. We should appreciate the scale of what it achieved, while also recognizing how much it left in shadow. It charted the visible coastlines of the human past. What it could not yet chart were the submerged connections, lineages without obvious faces, mixtures no bone alone could prove, and entire branches of humanity that left more of themselves in genes than in recognizable skeletons. So when the Denisova remains finally entered the story, they entered a world already full of questions, but still bounded by old habits of seeing. That is why the discovery feels so dramatic in retrospect. It did not merely answer an existing debate, it widened the debate beyond its older limits. It took a human world that once seemed populated by familiar names and showed that at least one major presence had been walking through that world, almost unseen. And once that possibility became real, another question rose immediately behind it. If bones and tools had taken us this far, what exactly could DNA now reveal that anatomy alone had missed for generations? The answer to that question would not remain inside old categories for long. For most of human history, the dead could only speak through what the eye could still see. A skull could show the shape of a forehead, the sweep of a brow ridge, the breadth of a face. A jaw could suggest diet, development, or a family resemblance to other fossils found far away. Teeth could preserve a surprising amount, surviving when much of the rest of the body had already been taken apart by time. Bones could tell us about injury, strain, and sometimes even repeated habits. Stone tools and ash layers could hint at intelligence, planning, and shared behavior. All of that was precious, and none of it was easy. Yet for all its power, this older way of reading the dead carried a quiet frustration. It depended on survival in visible form. If a population left only a few fragments, if those fragments were too broken or too ordinary looking, then much of its identity could remain sealed away. A person could once have belonged to a whole lineage, stood inside a network of relatives, and shared ancestry with populations spread across great distances, and none of that would be obvious from a small bone fragment in a cave. It is one of the strangest things about science, that a body can hide its deepest story even while its physical remains lie in your hand. The possibility of recovering ancient DNA changed that, not all at once, and not without years of failure, skepticism, and technical struggle, but it changed it all the same. DNA offered a different sort of archive, one written at a scale the eye could not read and preserved, when luck allowed, inside ancient tissue. Suddenly the question was not only what a fossil looked like, but what inheritance it carried. This shift is difficult to overstate. To read ancient DNA was to ask a bone not merely how it had been shaped, but who its people were related to, how long ago their line had separated from others, and whether traces of those relationships still lived in bodies walking around today. In older archaeology, a cave could yield a fragment and leave you wondering which known population it belonged to. In the age of ancient DNA, the same fragment might answer with a surprise no chart had prepared for. What made this especially astonishing in the Denisova case was the scale of what emerged from something so small. A little piece of bone, barely capable of inspiring awe on visual inspection alone, became a source of information more disruptive than many grander fossils. That reversal had a kind of beauty to it. For generations, human origins had depended on the visible. Now, the invisible was starting to rearrange the visible world. The old methods were not being discarded. They were being joined by a second language, one that could reveal kinship where anatomy had stalled. But learning to read that language required patience, discipline, and an almost obsessive suspicion of error, because ancient DNA is not simply waiting in a fossil the way ink waits on a page. It arrives damaged, incomplete, and endangered by everything that has happened to the remains since burial. To understand why ancient DNA once seemed nearly impossible to recover, it helps to think about how fragile living material really is. DNA is not a mystical signature floating untouched through time. It is a molecule, and molecules break. The moment an organism dies, the repair systems that once protected its cells stop working. Water, heat, oxygen, microbes, changing chemistry in the burial environment, and the gradual breakdown of tissue all begin attacking what remains. Over thousands of years, the long strands of DNA become shorter, more damaged, and more chemically altered. Much of it disappears entirely. What survives is often fragmented into tiny pieces, like sentences torn into scraps and soaked in mud. In warm climates, this destruction can be especially severe. Heat accelerates decay. Humidity encourages processes that erase the record. Even in cold environments, survival is never guaranteed. Preservation is a matter of conditions, time, luck, and the stubborn resilience of a few fragments. That alone would make ancient DNA difficult enough. But the greater danger, in many cases, is contamination. Modern human DNA is everywhere humans go. It lives in skin cells, in breath, in sweat, in the ordinary trace we leave on surfaces without noticing. When archaeologists excavate bones, when museum staff catalog them, when researchers transport them, touch them, speak near them, or examine them under less than perfectly controlled conditions, modern DNA can enter the story. This creates a profound problem. If you recover genetic material from an ancient bone, how do you know it belongs to the ancient individual rather than to the people who handled the specimen afterward? In the early years of ancient DNA research, this problem shadowed the entire field. Dramatic claims could be made, but if contamination had not been rigorously controlled, the claims risked collapsing under scrutiny. This is why skepticism played such an important role in the growth of paleogenetics. It was not enough to say that DNA had been found. Researchers had to prove, as convincingly as possible, that the DNA was authentically ancient. They had to show that the fragments bore the kinds of chemical damage expected from old material. They had to work in clean labs designed specifically to reduce contamination. They had to repeat procedures, compare sequences, and sometimes invite independent verification from other teams. Ancient DNA did not become persuasive because people wanted it to be true. It became persuasive because methods improved to the point where doubt could be answered with discipline rather than hope. There is something almost paradoxical here. Ancient DNA is powerful, partly because it is so fragile. Its very weakness forced the field to become meticulous. If the molecule had survived easily, careless results might have flooded the literature and confusion would have reigned. Instead, the difficulty of the task shaped a culture of caution. Researchers wore protective clothing, worked in isolated environments, and treated ancient specimens almost like whispering witnesses whose testimony could be ruined by the slightest interruption. That caution mattered enormously in the Denisova case, because the result was so unexpected that anything less than strict method would have made it easy to dismiss. The rise of ancient DNA science depended on more than clean rooms and careful hands. It also relied on changes in sequencing technology that transformed what researchers could do with minute and damaged samples. Early genetic methods often required relatively intact stretches of DNA and yielded limited amounts of information. That was a serious obstacle when dealing with ancient remains, where the surviving fragments are often tiny and chemically altered. Over time, however, technologies improved. Scientists became better at extracting small pieces, amplifying them, and assembling meaningful patterns from countless damaged fragments. Instead of hoping for a long, elegant sequence to survive intact, They learned to work with shattered remains of the genome and reconstruct information from them piece by piece. This is where the comparison to an archive becomes especially helpful. Imagine a manuscript that has been burned, soaked, and torn into thousands of tiny scraps. If you demanded complete pages before attempting to read it, you would learn almost nothing. But if you could gather huge numbers of fragments, identify recurring patterns, compare them with related texts, and build a statistical picture of what likely belonged where, then even a destroyed manuscript might begin to yield its message. Ancient DNA sequencing works in a somewhat similar way. The surviving genetic record is often badly broken, but enough fragments, handled properly and interpreted with care, can still reveal ancestry and relationship. A particularly important feature in this work is the pattern of damage caused by time. Ancient DNA does not merely arrive in shorter pieces. It often bears characteristic chemical changes at the ends of fragments, the sort of molecular wear expected from long burial. These damage signatures help researchers distinguish genuine ancient molecules from fresher contamination. In a sense, age marks the DNA in ways that can be recognized. The damage is inconvenient because it complicates sequencing, but it is also helpful because it acts like a kind of timestamp of decay. A sequence that lacks these signals may deserve suspicion. A sequence that shows them consistently becomes more trustworthy as ancient material. Another crucial step is context. Genetic results do not float free from archaeology. The sample's layer, age estimate, associated fauna, tools, and stratigraphic position all matter. A DNA sequence from an ancient cave means much more when it can be connected to well-documented excavation records and careful dating work. In Denisova Cave, this mattered because the site itself had already been studied as a deep archive of repeated occupation. Researchers were not dealing with an isolated curiosity found on a whim. They were working within a structured excavation environment where context had been taken seriously. That did not remove uncertainty, but it made the emerging genetic picture much harder to dismiss as a laboratory ghost. By the time the Denisova remains were analyzed genetically, the field of ancient DNA had already begun to prove its worth in studies of Neanderthals and other ancient populations. That earlier work mattered because it gave scientists reference points. They knew what Neanderthal DNA looked like at a broad level. They could compare unknown sequences against modern human and Neanderthal genomes and ask where the new sample fit. Without such reference points, a strange result would have been more difficult to interpret. But with them, a new sample could be placed within a growing map of human genetic relationships. The old world built by anatomy was now being joined by a second map, one drawn through inheritance instead of bone shape. When the Denisova sample began to yield DNA, the first task was not to invent a sensational story, but to ask a plain question: where does this sequence belong? If it matched modern human patterns, the mystery would narrow. If it matched Neanderthal data closely enough, that too would fit within an older model. A puzzling fossil could simply become one more example within already familiar variation. But the result refused that simplicity. The DNA from the Denisova remains indicated a lineage closely related to Neanderthals, yet distinct from them. It was not merely an odd Neanderthal from Siberia. It was not simply an early modern human with unusual traits. It represented a sister population, sharing a deeper ancestor with Neanderthals, but having followed its own evolutionary path. That conclusion was extraordinary for several reasons. First, it did not arise from a complete and visually commanding fossil. It arose from a small, fragmentary remain. Second, it revealed a major human lineage in a period and region already thought to be broadly understandable. Third, It suggested that the known human cast of late Eurasia had been incomplete in a way more dramatic than many had imagined. This was not a matter of renaming a specimen or tidying a branch on an existing chart. It was the addition of a population that had not been clearly recognized before at all. The immediate scientific response had to be careful, because new lineages are not declared lightly. Could the sample be contaminated? Could statistical quirks or methodological issues be creating an illusion of difference? Could the genetic sequence represent something more ordinary than it first appeared? Questions like these are not signs of resistance to truth. They are part of how extraordinary findings become solid. In the Denisova case, the answer came through repeated testing, better sequencing, and broader comparison. The strange result held. The more closely it was examined, the more real it became. What emerged was the outline of a human group that had lived in Asia and was genetically distinct enough to count as a separate lineage from Neanderthals, while still close enough to them that the two groups shared a comparatively recent common ancestor relative to modern humans. This matters because it reframed Eurasian prehistory. The older picture of modern humans plus Neanderthals had not been entirely wrong, but it had been incomplete. Another population had occupied at least parts of that world, and probably not as a tiny footnote. The genetic evidence implied depth, duration, and a broader historical presence than the fossil record alone had revealed. There was also a deeper philosophical shock in all of this. Scientists had discovered a major human lineage without first being able to picture it properly. In most older narratives of human evolution, a group enters public consciousness through bones, a famous skull, a jaw, a skeleton, or a body part distinctive enough to inspire reconstruction. Denisovans entered the story through ancestry before they entered it through appearance. We knew they existed genetically before we knew what sort of face to give them. That inversion unsettled long habits of scientific imagination. It reminded everyone that physical visibility and historical importance are not the same thing. Names carry power, and once the distinctiveness of the Denisova lineage became clear, the population needed one. The name Denisovan came from the cave itself, Denisova Cave, the place that had preserved the remains long enough for their molecular story to be heard. That naming has a quiet practicality to it. It does not pretend that we know what these people called themselves or how they imagined their own identity. It simply ties the scientific category to the site that first made recognition possible. Yet there is also something slightly haunting in that. A population that may once have ranged across great distances and shaped the ancestry of living people is remembered in modern science by the name of one cave. Once named, Denisovans entered the growing human family chart not as a wild speculation, but as a defined genetic branch. Their relationship to Neanderthals became one of the most important parts of the emerging picture. The two groups were close relatives, more closely related to one another than either was to modern humans. This meant that somewhere deeper in the past, an ancestral population had divided, with one branch giving rise to Neanderthals and another to Denisovans. That branching event must have happened long before the individuals represented in Denisova Cave lived and died. What the cave offered was not the origin of the lineage, but its undeniable recognition. This is where the discovery began to press beyond a single site. If Denisovans were real, how far had they spread? Did they live only in parts of Siberia or across much wider regions of Asia? Were some puzzling fossils found elsewhere actually Denisovan or related to them, even if no one had recognized this at the time? Did they overlap geographically with Neanderthals, with modern humans? How long did they survive? Each of these questions pushed the discovery outward, away from the cave and toward a wider map of human movement and contact. At the same time, The scarcity of obvious Denisovan fossils created an eerie imbalance. The genetic evidence could say with confidence that a major lineage existed. The visible fossil record, however, remained maddeningly thin. A few teeth, a finger bone, some fragmentary remains, and later additional finds and candidate specimens from Asia would help flesh out the picture. But the basic strangeness remained. Here was a human population of real importance, and yet one could not point to a rich row of Denisovan skeletons in museum displays. They were present and absent at once, strongly visible through genetics, weakly visible through anatomy. That combination is one reason the Denisovan story captures the imagination. It feels like the past yielding a truth from behind a veil. The title of this section, Reading the Dead Through DNA, matters for that reason. DNA did not replace the dead body. It completed it in a new way. Bone still mattered. Excavation still mattered. Dating, stratigraphy, and anatomical study still mattered. But DNA added a line of meaning the visible remains could not fully supply. It let the dead answer questions that their damaged skeletons could not answer alone. In Denisova Cave, a fragment no one could have made famous through appearance turned out to contain one of the most important historical introductions in modern paleoanthropology. It said, in effect, there were more people in the human past than you thought. That revelation did not stop at recognition. Once scientists knew Denisovans had existed, they could ask new kinds of questions about mixture and inheritance. Were Denisovans a separate branch that lived and vanished in isolation, or had they met and blended with other humans? Ancient DNA opened that door as well. Genetic comparison showed that the human past was not simply a story of branches separating forever. It was also a story of contact. Neanderthals and Denisovans were related, but the evidence also pointed toward interbreeding among ancient populations. The old image of isolated lineages, each moving cleanly through time until replacement, grew harder to maintain. Human history started to look more like a web than a row of separate tracks. This was perhaps the deeper intellectual change introduced by ancient DNA. It did not merely add names to the human family tree. It altered the shape of the tree itself. Trees branch, yes, but the human story now seemed full of branches that touched again, exchanged genes, and carried pieces of one another forward. That matters because it changes how we think about extinction and survival. A population may disappear as a distinct people and still persist in fragments of inheritance inside later groups. A lineage can be gone in one sense and present in another. The Denisovan discovery would soon become one of the clearest examples of this, though the full implications were only beginning to emerge. The first sequence from Denisova Cave therefore did more than identify a hidden lineage. It made a promise the field would spend years trying to understand. If one fragment could reveal a previously unrecognized branch of humanity, then ancient DNA might uncover other hidden connections buried in bones already excavated, in fossils still lying in caves and sediments, or even in the genomes of living populations. The cave had not simply yielded a new name, it had demonstrated a new way of seeing the past. There is a calm kind of wonder in that. For thousands of years, the remains at Denisova Cave lay in darkness, carrying information no human culture on Earth had the tools to read. Empires rose and fell, languages formed and vanished, religions spread, sciences grew, and all the while, the bone kept its record closed. Then, within the span of a few modern decades, laboratory methods became precise enough to open what seemed a sealed door. The dead were not speaking in a mystical sense. They were being measured, sequenced, compared, and interpreted, yet the effect still feels almost intimate. A small bone, damaged and incomplete, gave up a truth about the human family that had been hidden for tens of thousands of years. By now, the Denisovan lineage had stepped out of invisibility, but only partly. Scientists knew it was real. They knew it was distinct. They knew it stood close to Neanderthals, yet apart from them. They knew the old picture of late Eurasia had been too small. What they did not yet know, at least not fully, was what sort of people the Denisovans had been across the full breadth of their history. What did they look like in life? How broad was their range? How many times had they met other humans? And how could a population so elusive in bone become so consequential in the long story of our species? The answers would begin with a troubling fact. The Denisovans were no longer merely an anomaly from one cave. They were becoming evidence that the human past had been crowded by presences we had only just begun to notice. By the time the Denisovan lineage had been recognized through DNA, the human story had already changed in a way that would not be reversed. There was no longer any serious path back to the older, simpler picture of late Eurasia as a world defined mainly by modern humans and Neanderthals. Another presence had entered the record. Yet this new presence arrived in an unusual form. Most ancient human groups became real to both scientists and the public through anatomy first. We picture a skull, a reconstructed face, a jawbone, a skeleton in a museum case. Denisovans entered the world in almost the opposite way. They were genetically solid before they were visually familiar. Their existence became undeniable before their physical form could be confidently imagined. That strange order of discovery gave them an almost ghost-like quality. They were not imaginary. They were scientifically real. But compared with Neanderthals, they remained nearly faceless, a branch of humanity known more through inheritance than through appearance. This is one of the reasons the Denisovan story feels so unsettling and so memorable. It reveals how much of the past can remain hidden even after generations of serious research. A vanished human population had been living in the scientific blind spot between what fossils could clearly show and what older methods could reliably classify. Once DNA pulled that population into view, the next challenge was to understand what exactly had been found. Who were these people? How long had they existed as a separate lineage? Where did they live? And why had they remained so hard to recognize from bones alone? The first answer was relational rather than visual. Denisovans were closely related to Neanderthals, sharing a common ancestral population after the deeper split that separated the ancestors of both groups from the line, leading to modern humans. In plain terms, if one imagined the human family tree as it was then beginning to be redrawn, Denisovans and Neanderthals stood like sibling branches, each distinct, each carrying its own history, and each more closely connected to the other than either was to us. That relationship mattered because it placed Denisovans not at the far edges of human evolution, but near the center of the late archaic human world. They were not some obscure leftover from a remote and barely knowable age. They belonged to a chapter of prehistory already populated by famous and important human groups. Yet even with that relationship established, there remained a striking imbalance in what researchers knew. Neanderthals were represented by many fossils across Europe and Western Asia. Their anatomy, variation, injuries, habits, and regional differences had been studied in depth. Denisovans, by contrast, seemed to stand behind a thin curtain of fragments. There were teeth, a finger bone, later additional pieces, and candidate fossils from other sites that might connect to them. But there was no great abundance of complete Denisovan skeletons to arrange in a row. That scarcity did not weaken their importance. It made their importance more astonishing. A major human lineage had helped shape the story of our species, while leaving behind only a sparse and scattered visible trail. In that sense, Denisovans were the lost humans we never knew, not because they were unimportant, but because the past had hidden them almost too well. One of the most remarkable things about Denisovans is that their discovery forced science to admit a simple but humbling truth. A human population can be widespread and significant without leaving an obvious fossil identity behind. This sounds strange at first because we are used to linking importance with visibility. We assume the biggest players in history must leave the clearest traces, but the deep past does not work that way. Geological luck, burial conditions, cave use, climate, erosion, and the sheer accident of what gets preserved all shape the record more than any sense of fairness. A population may thrive across thousands of miles and still leave only rare bones in places where preservation happened to favor survival. Another may be known from a richer fossil sample, simply because one region protected its dead more kindly than another. For Denisovans, this unevenness was extreme. The genetic evidence made clear that they were not trivial. They represented a real branch of humanity, with a history deep enough to separate them from Neanderthals and modern humans long before the individuals from Denisova cave lived. That fact alone implied time, geography, and repeated generations of successful survival. No lineage becomes genetically distinct by passing through history as a brief accident. Denisovans must have inhabited landscapes, raised children, adapted to local conditions, and occupied ecological spaces for long periods. They were not a laboratory invention created from a few fragments. They were once living communities spread through parts of the ancient world. And yet the bones themselves remained scarce enough to provoke a peculiar emotional response. Scientists could say with confidence that Denisovans existed, but they could not point to them with the same visual assurance available for Neanderthals. Much of what the public tends to crave from ancient history, a recognizable face, a clear body type, a simple visual identity, was still missing. That absence invited two opposite errors. One was to treat Denisovans as shadowy and almost mythical, as though their limited fossil record made them speculative. The other was to fill the gaps too quickly with certainty, imagining we already knew more about their appearance and way of life than the evidence allowed. Good science had to resist both temptations. Denisovans were real enough to change textbooks, yet elusive enough to require unusual restraint. This is where the Denisovan story becomes a lesson in historical humility. We often imagine that once science identifies something, the object becomes fully visible, but discovery is often partial. One question is answered, and 10 more appear. DNA could establish Denisovans as a lineage. It could place them in relation to Neanderthals and modern humans. It could even hint at their later significance through admixture with living populations. What it could not do by itself was supply a full physical portrait or a complete cultural history. Those would have to be reconstructed, cautiously and unevenly, from a patchwork of fossils, sites, environments, and comparisons. The lost humans had been found, but only in part. Their teeth became especially important in those early efforts to understand them anatomically. Teeth survive better than many other bones, and they often preserve useful information about growth, diet, ancestry, and population relationships. The Denisovan molars found at Denisova cave were strikingly large enough to attract serious attention. In some respects, they seemed more archaic than one might expect for remains from such a comparatively late period. This mattered because teeth can sometimes act like stubborn witnesses, preserving features that skulls and limb bones may not. The Denisovan teeth hinted that these people were not merely Neanderthals in another region or modern humans with an unusual genetic signature. They carried anatomical patterns that suggested a complex and perhaps unexpectedly deep story of their own. Still, teeth alone cannot provide a full portrait. They tell us that a person chewed, developed, and inherited certain forms. They do not tell us what the entire face looked like, how the body moved, or which traits varied from one Denisovan population to another. That limitation shaped much of the early discussion. Scientists knew they were dealing with a distinct lineage, but they had to be careful not to pretend that a few dramatic dental traits could stand in for a whole people. This is a recurring challenge in human origins research. The temptation to let a striking fragment speak beyond its evidence is always present. A responsible account has to let the fragment speak clearly, but not more clearly than it is able. There is also an important possibility here. Denisovans may not have been anatomically uniform across all the regions they occupied. Modern humans show variation. Neanderthals showed variation. There is no reason to assume Denisovans were all physically identical across vast stretches of Asia and over long periods of time. If their population covered broad and diverse landscapes, then local adaptation, isolation, and contact with neighboring groups could all have shaped their appearance. This makes the hunt for Denisovan fossils even more challenging. A specimen in one place may not match neatly with a specimen in another, even if both belong within the same broad lineage or closely related populations. That helps explain why the Denisovan fossil record may have remained hidden for so long. Some fossils in Asia that looked puzzling or hard to classify might, in hindsight, belong somewhere within the Denisovan story, whether directly or along nearby branches of the same broader evolutionary world. But fossil classification works best when scientists already know what pattern to look for. Before Denisovans had a name and a genetic identity, many unusual remains could only be judged against the categories already available. Once the Denisovan lineage became real, older specimens could be reconsidered in a new light. That did not mean every puzzling Asian fossil suddenly became Denisovan, far from it. But it did mean the field gained a new possibility, a new reference point, and a new reason to suspect that Asia had been preserving a more crowded human history than older models had allowed. The teeth, then, were more than anatomical curiosities. They were reminders that visible evidence had not vanished from the story. Denisovans were not DNA alone. They had bodies, and those bodies were beginning, slowly, to emerge from the fossil record. The challenge was that they emerged in fragments, often too small to satisfy the imagination, but more than enough to deepen the mystery. As researchers began looking beyond Denisova Cave, the possibility grew that Denisovans or Denisovan-related populations had occupied a very wide geographic range. This mattered enormously. If Denisovans were known only from one cave in Siberia, their significance would still be great, but their place in human history might seem localized. The genetic evidence, however, pointed towards something much larger. Their lineage was old enough and consequential enough that it was unlikely to have been confined to one small corner of Asia. The question was no longer whether they existed, but how extensive their world had been. This is where the story becomes both broader and more difficult. Asia is vast. Its ancient environments range from cold northern forests and mountain systems to temperate zones, open grasslands, subtropical regions, and island landscapes farther south and east. A population spread across such settings might not leave the same archaeological signature everywhere. Their bodies might vary. Their tools might vary, especially if material resources differed from one region to another. Some sites might preserve bones well, Others might preserve almost nothing. This makes a single, simple Denisovan portrait unlikely from the start. The more seriously one takes the size of Asia, the more one expects regional complexity. Later finds and candidate associations would reinforce the sense that Denisovans, or closely related groups within their broader genetic sphere, were not limited to one cave. This does not mean every detail became immediately clear. It means the old map had to expand. Denisovans were becoming less like a strange local surprise and more like a population whose history intersected major routes of human movement across the continent. That wider presence would help explain why their genetic legacy later appeared in living populations far from Siberia. A lineage cannot leave marks across such distances without having once inhabited a substantial world of its own. The deeper implication here is that human evolution in Asia may have involved multiple overlapping populations whose boundaries were less rigid than older models assumed. Denisovans were not simply a third label to add beside Neanderthals and modern humans, as if the story now had 3 neat compartments instead of 2. Their discovery pointed toward a prehistory of contacts, regional survival, branching, and mixture that probably varied from place to place. In one region, Denisovans may have been the dominant archaic population. In another, they may have met other groups only occasionally. In still another, they may have blended with newcomers and disappeared as a distinct people while leaving genetic traces behind. This makes them fascinating, but it also makes them frustrating. They resist becoming a tidy museum category. The more one learns, the less they look like a population that can be summarized in one sentence. They are not important merely because they were unknown. They are important because their hidden existence reveals how incomplete clean categories can be when applied to the ancient human world. Denisovans force us to imagine prehistory not as a stage with a few isolated actors, but as a shifting human landscape with lineages meeting, separating, and surviving in ways our old diagrams barely captured. That realization also changes how we think about extinction. When people hear that a human lineage vanished, they often picture a simple ending. The last members die, the line is gone, and only fossils remain. But Denisovans complicate that picture. Even before this story reaches the later question of their genetic legacy in living people, it is already clear that disappearance as a distinct population does not necessarily mean disappearance without remainder. A lineage may lose its visible independence while parts of it move into other populations through interbreeding. It may vanish as a separate people while still influencing the biological future of those who remain. That possibility turns extinction from a final wall into something more complicated and more human. The Denisovan case also reminds us that recognition can lag far behind reality. These people lived, adapted, reproduced, and interacted in their own time, without any need for modern science to validate their existence. For tens of thousands of years they were part of the human world. Only much later did technology become refined enough for us to notice them properly. That gap between ancient reality and modern recognition is sobering. It suggests that the past does not arrange itself according to our categories. It waits, often imperfectly, for enough evidence and the right tools to make itself legible. There is something quietly moving in that thought. Somewhere in the ancient landscapes of Asia, Denisovan communities once moved through seasons, shelters, dangers, and routines, just as every human group has done. They raised children, read weather, found food, remembered places, and made choices within the limits of their world. To them, they were not missing humans. They were simply people. The label Denisovan is ours, applied long after the fact, built from caves, fragments, and genomes. It is a necessary scientific tool, but it can also hide the living reality behind the category. When we say a lineage was lost, what we really mean is that our knowledge of it was lost. The people themselves were present enough in their own day. That is why the sparse Denisovan fossil record feels so powerful. It creates a tension between the scale of a real population and the thinness of what visibly survives. A few teeth, a finger bone, fragments of skull, uncertain associations from other sites, these are not much to build a human portrait from. Yet when joined with genetic evidence, they become enough to reopen the whole architecture of the human family. It is a reminder that historical magnitude and material abundance are not the same thing. Sometimes the most important truths survive in the least impressive fragments. And this is where Denisovans move beyond novelty. They are not interesting merely because they were hidden. They matter because their hiddenness reveals something fundamental about the way human history is buried. Fossils do not preserve the world evenly. Categories do not arise automatically from bones. Whole populations can lie half-seen at the edge of knowledge until a new method changes what counts as evidence. In that sense, Denisovans are not just one more branch of the family tree. They are proof that the tree itself had been drawn under conditions of partial blindness. Once that blindness began to lift, the human past looked denser and more mysterious than before. Denisovans were no longer an anomaly attached to a single cave. They had become a major test of whether science could accept a more crowded and less tidy account of our origins. Their existence suggested that other hidden relationships might be waiting in ancient bones already found or still buried. It also warned against overconfidence. If one major lineage had remained obscure until the age of ancient DNA, then certainty about the full cast of human prehistory had to be held more lightly. At the same time, Denisovans brought a kind of wonder back into a field often forced to speak in careful increments. Not wonder in the sense of fantasy or exaggerated mystery, but wonder rooted in scale. A lineage of human relatives had lived across parts of Asia, close enough to Neanderthals to share ancestry, close enough to modern humans to matter later in our story, and yet obscure enough that the scientific world had spent generations without seeing them clearly. That is a profound correction. It tells us that the human past was not only older and broader than once assumed, but also more socially crowded, more entangled, and less visually obvious. Still, even after accepting their reality, we are left with the same quiet frustration that makes Denisovans so haunting. We know enough to be sure they existed. We know enough to place them in the family. We know enough to see that they mattered. But we do not possess the richness of fossil detail that would let them stand before us with the same familiarity that Neanderthals now command. In a strange way, Denisovans remain suspended between discovery and obscurity. The science has rescued them from invisibility, but not from incompleteness. That incompleteness is not a flaw in the story, it is part of the story. The Denisovans teach us that evidence does not arrive in the order we would prefer. Sometimes ancestry appears before anatomy. Sometimes a lineage becomes real through molecules before it gains a face. Sometimes a population changes human history before science can even admit it knew they were there. That is exactly what happened here. The lost humans we never knew were not marginal to the human story. They were woven into it all along. And once that became clear, another question pressed forward with greater force than ever. If Denisovans had once moved through such a broad world, and if their line had crossed paths with other humans rather than living in total isolation, then their story could not end in the caves and fragments alone. Some part of them must have traveled onward through other bodies, other populations, and other futures. The dead had already spoken through DNA once by revealing a hidden people. The next revelation would be even more startling. These vanished humans were not entirely gone. Their history was still walking the earth. The most astonishing part of the Denisovan story may not be that scientists discovered a hidden human lineage in a Siberian cave. It may be that the story did not end there. Ancient populations are often imagined as sealed inside the past. We picture them as gone, separated from us by time so completely that they can only be approached through stone, bone, and careful reconstruction. That is usually how extinction feels in the imagination. Final, quiet, absolute. But Denisovans unsettled that feeling in a deeply personal way. Once researchers began comparing ancient genomes with the DNA of living people, it became clear that these lost humans had not simply vanished without remainder. They had left pieces of themselves behind in us. That realization changes the emotional center of the story. Denisovans are no longer only a hidden branch on an academic chart, or a handful of fragments in a cave, or a puzzle resolved by laboratory technique. They become something much closer. Their history enters the present tense. It enters living bodies. It enters inheritance, adaptation, and the silent record carried through generations that never knew the name Denisovan, but still bore traces of encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. In that sense, Denisovans were not only found in ancient bone, they were also found, unexpectedly, in the modern world. This does not mean living people are Denisovans in a simple or categorical sense. Human ancestry is layered, mixed, and shared across long time spans. The point is subtler and more profound. Some populations alive today carry measurable Denisovan ancestry because at certain moments in the deep past, the ancestors of modern humans met Denisovan populations and had children with them. Those children belonged to later generations, and those later generations carried Denisovan DNA forward. Over immense stretches of time, through migration, selection, and ordinary reproduction, fragments of that ancient lineage remained alive inside modern human populations. A vanished people had not survived as a separate civilization, but part of their biological history had survived in human beings living right now. This was one of the great lessons of paleogenetics. Extinction is not always clean. A lineage may disappear as a distinct people and yet continue in traces, scattered through descendants who belong to other populations. The ancient human world, once imagined as a sequence of replacements, now looked more like a network of meetings. Populations met, overlapped, exchanged genes, and sometimes passed useful traits onward. The Denisovan story became one of the clearest examples of this. The hidden humans in the cave were no longer only objects of archaeological recovery. They were ancestors in a limited but very real sense, contributors to the human present. The first clues came through broad genetic comparison. Once scientists had a Denisovan genome to work with, they could ask whether any living populations carried segments of DNA more closely related to Denisovans than to Neanderthals or other known lineages. The answer was yes, and not merely in a faint or accidental way. The strongest Denisovan ancestry appeared in populations in parts of Asia and Oceania, especially among peoples whose ancestors had histories connected to Eastern and Southeastern roots through the ancient world. This mattered enormously. It meant the Denisovan story was not confined to the cold landscapes around Denisova Cave. The lineage had interacted with human populations much farther afield. That was a clue not only about ancestry, but about geography. If living populations in regions far from Siberia carried Denisovan DNA, then Denisovans themselves, or closely related groups within that wider branch, must once have occupied a much broader range than the cave alone would suggest. Ancient humans do not leave ancestry across continents. by standing still. Their presence had to be wider, more mobile, or more regionally varied than the early fossil record alone could show. In this way, living DNA helped reveal the missing map of an ancient people's range. The pattern also showed that interbreeding between ancient human groups was not some rare and meaningless accident. It happened enough to leave detectable marks in descendants many thousands of years later. That is one of the great corrections delivered by ancient DNA. For a long time, many popular accounts imagined different human groups as sharply separated, almost like sealed compartments. Modern humans were one thing, Neanderthals another, and any contact between them, if admitted at all, was treated as exceptional or biologically unimportant. The genetic evidence forced a more complicated truth into view. Ancient human populations did not always remain apart. They met. They had children. Those children belonged to the real history of humanity, and some of their inherited traits remained important long after the original populations themselves had disappeared as distinct groups. Denisovans became central to this new picture, because their legacy in living people was not merely symbolic, it was measurable. Geneticists could identify specific segments of Denisovan-related DNA and compare how those segments appeared in different modern populations. Some groups carried more, some less, and some almost none at all. This unevenness itself told a story. It suggested that ancient contacts had been regional, historically specific, and shaped by the routes taken by different human populations as they spread across Asia and beyond. Human evolution was no longer a clean march from one group to the next. It was a series of movements through occupied landscapes, where encounters could change the genetic future. One of the most powerful examples of this concerns life at high altitude. Among Tibetan populations, researchers identified a gene variant associated with adaptation to low-oxygen environments at high elevations. That variant appears to have entered modern human ancestry through Denisovan-related admixture. This matters because high-altitude living places extreme physiological demands on the body. The air contains less oxygen. People not adapted to such conditions can suffer serious strain, especially over long periods. The fact that a Denisovan-derived genetic contribution may have helped later human populations thrive in such environments is extraordinary. It means that contact with a now-vanished lineage did not merely leave a historical trace. It may have improved survival under specific ecological conditions. This changes the way we think about ancient interbreeding. It was not just a detail added to a family tree. It could have practical consequences. A trait introduced through contact with another population might help descendants cope with cold, disease, diet, altitude, or other environmental pressures. In the Denisovan case, some inherited genetic material appears to have given modern humans access to adaptations shaped in populations that had already spent long periods living in particular Asian environments. In plain language, ancient meetings may have allowed newcomers to borrow biology from those already adapted to local conditions. That idea is both elegant and humbling. It suggests that survival in the human past was not always a matter of one group replacing another through sheer superiority. Sometimes, success may have depended partly on mixture, on receiving inherited tools shaped in bodies that had lived under very different conditions for many generations. This does not erase conflict, competition, or demographic change. Ancient human life was certainly hard, and populations did disappear. But the Denisovan legacy reminds us that contact could also create continuity where we might otherwise see only endings. There may have been other Denisovan-derived genetic contributions as well, some related to immune function, some still debated, and some likely more subtle than the dramatic high-altitude example. The science in these areas continues to develop, and responsible storytelling has to preserve that caution. Not every suggested Denisovan influence will survive further study. Genetic effects are complex, and human biology rarely offers single-cause explanations for large outcomes. Still, the broad pattern is clear enough to stand firmly. Denisovan ancestry in living humans is not an empty relic. In certain cases, it appears to have mattered biologically. The vanished left something usable behind. This is one of the moments where the story becomes almost intimate. A hidden population, scarcely visible in the fossil record, may have helped shape how later humans live in demanding environments. Their bodies are gone. Their languages, beliefs, and daily worlds are almost entirely lost. Yet parts of their biological experience moved forward through inheritance. The cave held bones. The present holds echoes. The broader implication is that ancient human populations were not isolated experiments unfolding in parallel with no contact. They were neighbors, however unevenly, sometimes separated by distance, sometimes by ecology, sometimes by time, but at key points they came into contact and exchanged more than space. The older vision of human evolution often encouraged people to imagine clear boundaries, each population occupying its own lane until one disappeared. Denisovan ancestry in living humans makes that vision much harder to defend. Boundaries existed, certainly, but they were not perfect walls. Human groups could remain distinct over long stretches and still meet often enough to leave descendants. That matters because it changes the shape of the human family tree itself. A simple tree branches outward and stays separated. What the genetic evidence increasingly suggests is something more tangled. Branches split, but sometimes they touch again. A population can diverge over long periods, developing its own path, then later contribute some of its genes to another group. The resulting picture is not chaos, but it is far more braided than earlier models allowed. Denisovans help make that braided history visible. There is a deep lesson in this about what it means to belong to one human species now. The modern world is inhabited by Homo sapiens alone, and that can make us project simplicity backward, as though singularity was always the natural state of humanity. It was not. For much of prehistory, the human world seems to have included multiple populations, some quite closely related, others more distant, each adapted to different circumstances, and each moving through environments that sometimes overlapped. The fact that we are now one surviving human species should not trick us into imagining that our past was equally singular. Denisovans are one of the strongest proofs that it was not. At the same time, their genetic survival complicates the very idea of disappearance. If a Denisovan population ceased to exist as an independent lineage, but some of its genes continued in modern humans, then what exactly vanished? A people vanished in one sense. Their separate identity, whatever it meant in lived reality, did not continue into the historical era, yet elements of their biological history persisted. This is not immortality, and it should not be romanticized into something vague. It is a precise scientific point with philosophical weight. Extinction may erase a population's independence, while leaving behind fragments of inheritance that continue to shape later lives. This makes the Denisovan story feel less like a sealed tomb and more like a buried current still moving beneath the present. It also explains why the discovery mattered so much beyond academic circles. People are fascinated by ancestry not only because it organizes the past, but because it touches identity. To learn that some living populations carry Denisovan DNA is to learn that the human story is populated by forgotten meetings that still matter. The present body becomes a kind of archive. Not a perfect one, and not one that speaks in simple slogans, but an archive all the same. There is, however, an important caution in how this should be understood. Genetic ancestry is not a mythic badge, and it does not divide modern people into simple categories of closeness or distance from lost human groups. All living humans share overwhelmingly recent common ancestry compared with the deep timescales involved here. Denisovan DNA in some populations does not make those populations less modern, more archaic, or more mysterious in any sensational sense. That kind of language would betray the science. The importance of Denisovan ancestry lies not in ranking people, but in showing how the human past was formed through encounter, movement, and mixture. That caution matters because discoveries about ancestry often attract the wrong kind of fascination. People want identity to be simple, dramatic, and absolute. Deep human history rarely offers that. What it offers instead is a layered account of relatedness, adaptation, and chance. Some populations carry more Denisovan ancestry because their ancestors happened to move through worlds where contact with Denisovans occurred. Others do not because their ancestral roots were different. These are historical patterns, not value judgments. The beauty of the Denisovan discovery is not that it creates new divisions. It is that it reveals how connected, entangled, and shared the human story has been. It also reminds us that ancient encounters had consequences that no one living through them could have understood in modern genetic terms. Imagine two populations meeting in a distant landscape, perhaps after generations of separate history. They do not know they are shaping scientific debates tens of thousands of years in the future. They are simply living. Yet the children born from such encounters may carry traits that later help descendants survive in difficult environments. This is one of the quiet wonders of evolution. It works without foresight, and still its results can look almost purposeful when seen across immense spans of time. The Denisovan contribution to modern humans also highlights a larger truth about adaptation. Useful traits do not always arise independently in every population that needs them. Sometimes they travel through inheritance from neighboring groups already shaped by local conditions. In that sense, contact among ancient humans could act as a shortcut for survival, allowing one population to benefit from another's long biological experience in a region. That possibility gives Denisovans a place not only in the genealogy of the human species, but in the environmental story of how humans learn to live in difficult parts of the world. So the DNA still walking among us is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a literal statement, though it must be handled with care. Ancient Denisovan-derived sequences remain in living human genomes. Some are small, some functionally important, many likely neutral, and all carried forward through the ordinary processes of inheritance. The hidden people of Denisova Cave are gone in body, culture, and independent continuity. Yet part of their history is present in lungs working at altitude, in immune responses, in inherited sequences passed quietly from parent to child. A population the fossil record barely revealed turned out to be part of the living human condition. That realization brings the story to one of its most powerful turning points. At first, the Denisovan discovery seemed to be about correction. A hidden lineage had been added to the chart. A cave had yielded an unexpected human branch. Ancient DNA had exposed the incompleteness of older models. But once Denisovan ancestry was found in living populations, the discovery became more than correction. It became integration. Denisovans were no longer outside the main human story, waiting to be inserted. They had always been inside it. We had simply failed to see where. This is why the phrase, "its DNA changed human history," is not an exaggeration. The change happened in more than one sense. Denisovan DNA changed the scientific history of human origins by forcing researchers to redraw relationships among ancient populations. It changed the narrative history of humanity by revealing that late prehistory was more crowded and interconnected than many had imagined. And it changed biological history, in the literal sense, by contributing inherited traits to living humans. The Denisovan story is therefore not about one fossil puzzle neatly solved. It is about a vanished population whose existence altered the way our species survived, spread, and understands itself. Yet even this does not close the mystery. It opens it wider. If Denisovans contributed ancestry to modern humans in some parts of the world, then when and where did those meetings happen? Were there multiple episodes of contact? Did different Denisovan populations contribute different genetic material? Were some groups more closely related to the Denisovans of Siberia while others belonged to branches farther south or east? The more scientists learned, the less Denisovans looked like a single fixed point, and the more they resembled a broad and varied human presence stretching across ancient Asia. That means the cave in Siberia, for all its importance, was not the whole story. It was a doorway. Through it, researchers glimpsed a world in which forgotten humans moved through mountains, valleys, forests, and plateaus, encountered our ancestors, and left behind more than fossils. They left influence. They left inheritance. They left evidence that modern humanity was shaped, not in isolation, but in company. And perhaps that is the deepest change Denisovans brought to the story of human origins. They made it harder to believe in clean lines. They replaced a simpler family portrait with one full of crossings, partial survivals, and unexpected deaths. The dead did not remain sealed in the cave. Their DNA walked out into the present long before anyone learned how to read it. And once that became visible, only one question remained large enough to carry us forward. If the human story has already been revised this dramatically by one hidden lineage, how much of the past still lies waiting in buried bone, in overlooked fossils, and in the genomes we have only begun to understand? A single fragment of skull should not have been enough to do this. That is perhaps the calmest way to begin the ending. A broken piece of bone from a cave in Siberia, small enough to disappear in the hand, should not have been able to reopen the structure of the human past. Yet that is what happened. By the time the Denisovan story reached this point, the old picture of humanity had been changed at every level. The family tree looked different. The geography of ancient populations looked different. The meaning of extinction looked different. Even the relationship between the dead and the living looked different. What began as an archaeological problem had become a rearrangement of human history. For a long time, the human story had been told in a way that was not exactly false, but too clean. There were older populations and newer ones, migrations and disappearances, branches splitting apart and leaving one another behind. Even when the details were complex, the broader picture still favored separation. Neanderthals were one line, modern humans were another. The past looked crowded only in brief moments, as if human groups occasionally overlapped but remained mostly distinct. Denisovans made that older picture harder to sustain. They did not simply add a third name to a short list. They exposed a deeper truth. The ancient human world had been fuller, more entangled, and less visually obvious than scientists had once imagined. That matters because a new piece of information is not always the same thing as a new way of thinking. Some discoveries fill gaps without disturbing the overall structure. The Denisovan discovery did not do that. It changed the structure itself. It showed that a major lineage could remain almost invisible in the fossil record, and still leave a lasting biological legacy. It showed that ancient DNA could identify relationships no skull alone could have settled. It showed that late prehistory, far from being a simple stage occupied by a few well-known players, may have been a shifting world of repeated contacts, regional survival, and partial blending. The human story became less like a line and more like a field of crossings. This ending, then, is not really an ending in the usual sense. It is more like standing still for a moment and looking back at how much changed. We began with a cave, with dust, cold rock, and small remains that refused to fit the expected order. We moved through the older human map, through the rise of ancient DNA, through the recognition of the Denisovans as a real lineage, and through the startling discovery that they still survive in fragments within living people. Now the final task is to hold those pieces together and ask what they mean when taken as a whole. What kind of human story do they leave us with? What has to be abandoned from the old picture, and what new picture can take its place? The answer is not perfect clarity. It is not a final chart in which every ancient population has been placed forever in its proper position. The human past is still incomplete, still buried, still vulnerable to surprise. But the Denisovan discovery gives us enough to say something important with confidence. Human history was not simple. It was not tidy, and it was not made by a single surviving lineage walking alone toward the present. For long stretches of time, humanity existed in the plural. That phrase matters, humanity in the plural. In the modern world, we are used to one human species spread across the globe. Differences among living populations exist, of course, but they exist within a single surviving human lineage. It is very easy to project that singularity backward and imagine it as the natural condition of the past. Yet the evidence now suggests something quite different. For much of deep history, the world included multiple human populations at once. Some were close relatives. Some had separated long before. Some occupied neighboring regions. Some likely met rarely. Others met enough to exchange genes, technologies, and perhaps habits of survival. The world that produced us was not empty except for our own ancestors. It was populated. Denisovans matter because they make that plural world harder to ignore. Neanderthals had already done part of that work. They had shown, long before DNA confirmed the details of interbreeding, that modern humans were not alone in the ancient world. But there is a difference between knowing there was another human population and realizing there were more populations than the older record had even clearly named. Denisovans introduced a deeper level of uncertainty, and with it, a deeper level of realism. If one important lineage had remained hidden this long, then the past was likely more layered than the old diagrams ever suggested. This does not mean anything goes. It does not mean every strange bone must belong to a lost people or that human prehistory is an endless parade of unnamed species. Good science still requires caution, evidence, testing, and the willingness to leave some questions unresolved. But caution no longer supports the older simplicity. It supports a more flexible truth. Ancient human populations were real, diverse, and often interconnected. Some left many fossils, some left few, some can be seen anatomically, some emerge first through genetics. The record is uneven, but the pattern is unmistakable. The human past was made of more company than we once believed. There is something deeply human in this realization. We tend to search the past for origins that are singular and stable. We want a clear story of who we are and where we came from. Denisovans interrupt that comfort, but not in a destructive way. They offer a richer account instead. They suggest that our origins are not the result of one isolated line progressing cleanly through time. They suggest that our history includes meetings, borrowings, exchanges, and inheritances from people whose names we never knew and whose bones only barely survived. The result is not confusion for its own sake. It is a more truthful complexity. And perhaps that complexity is appropriate. Human beings have always lived in relation to others. We trade, marry, learn, compete, imitate, cooperate, and adapt within social worlds larger than ourselves. Why should the deepest human past have been any different? Denisovans remind us that even at the scale of species and lineages, our story may have been shaped by relationship as much as by separation. The old image of pure lines moving past one another like ships in darkness now feels too stiff for the evidence we have. The new image is harder to draw, but closer to life. Another major change brought by the Denisovan discovery concerns how we think about evidence itself. For generations, the fossil record was the primary route into human origins. It remains indispensable, and nothing in the Denisovan story diminishes that. Without careful excavation, dating, and anatomical comparison, there would have been no context in which the Denisova remains could matter. The cave had to be found, studied, and preserved. The bones had to be recognized as worth testing. Archaeology made the discovery possible. Yet the discovery also showed the limits of a world, built mainly from what the eye could classify. This matters because science is often shaped by the tools available at a given time. People do not simply choose which truths to know. They work within what can be seen, measured, and trusted. Before ancient DNA, a lineage like the Denisovans could pass through the fossil record as ambiguity. A tooth too large, a fragment too incomplete, a specimen too isolated from others, each could raise suspicion without providing a new name. Once ancient DNA became reliable, a second archive opened. Bone no longer had to speak only through shape. It could speak through inheritance. That shift did more than add detail. It changed the authority structure of the evidence. A fragmentary fossil that might once have been considered too limited to matter greatly could now become central if it preserved authentic DNA. A tiny sample could reveal relatedness, divergence, admixture, and hidden branches of ancestry. The scale of the bone no longer matched the scale of the information inside it. This is one of the quiet revolutions at the heart of the Denisovan story. Human history was altered not by a more impressive fossil, but by a new way of listening. There is a useful lesson in that beyond this one case. The past is never simply there, waiting to be known in full. It becomes knowable in stages, as methods improve and old materials are read in new ways. A bone dug up a century ago may tell one story to the people who first found it, and a different story to later generations with new techniques. A cave may preserve evidence for decades before anyone realizes which questions should be asked of it. In this sense, history is not only the recovery of what happened, it is also the recovery of what the surviving record can finally be made to reveal. Denisovans therefore changed not only the content of human history, but the practice of recovering it. They helped establish ancient DNA as one of the most transformative tools in the study of our origins. They demonstrated that visible anatomy, while vital, is not the whole record, and they taught researchers to be more modest in the face of absence. A population may be missing from the obvious fossil narrative and still be present in deeper ways. When a field learns that lesson, it becomes both more cautious and more open. It learns to distrust tidy conclusions built from incomplete visibility, and that is exactly what happened here. The Denisovan discovery also changed the meaning of disappearance. Before paleogenetics, Extinction in human evolution was often imagined in blunt terms. A population existed, then it did not. Its fossils remained, perhaps its tools, perhaps traces of its behavior, but the line itself ended. That still happens, of course. There are real endings in history. Yet Denisovans complicated the picture by showing that the end of a distinct population does not always mean the end of its contribution. A lineage can vanish as an independent people and still survive in inherited fragments inside others. This matters for more than scientific accuracy. It changes the emotional texture of the human story. Extinction no longer looks only like silence. It can also look like diffusion. A people may lose its separate continuity, yet pieces of its biological experience may move forward into future populations. In the Denisovan case, that movement appears to have mattered in practical ways, helping later humans adapt to difficult environments. So the story is not only that a hidden lineage once existed, it is that the lineage continued to shape the future after its visible independence was gone. There is something powerful in that because it resists two opposite mistakes. One mistake is to romanticize Denisovans as if they somehow live on unchanged in the present. They do not. They are gone as a distinct human population. Their cultures, languages, and daily worlds are not recoverable in full, and no living community is simply a Denisovan community under another name. The other mistake is to imagine they vanished without consequence. That is not true either. Their genes, in certain populations and in certain functions, remained part of the human present. The truth sits between those extremes. Denisovans are lost and present at the same time, depending on what one means by survival. This, in turn, changes how we view the deep past as a whole. Ancient populations may not have met only to compete for territory or replace one another. They may also have exchanged useful adaptations, passed on traits shaped by long local experience, and contributed to futures they could never have imagined. Human history becomes less like a series of sealed containers and more like a current in which identities form, separate, and sometimes merge. That picture is not softer or more sentimental than the old one. It is simply more complex and, in many ways, more realistic. It also restores a certain dignity to forgotten populations. Denisovans are not merely curiosities known for being hidden. They were participants in the making of later humanity. The cave did not give us a dead branch with no bearing on the present. It gave us evidence that people once thought absent from the record had already entered the future through inheritance. That is why the discovery matters beyond the technical field of human evolution. It changes the way people imagine what it means for the past to remain with us. The past is not always visible in monuments, names, or memory. Sometimes it persists in bodies. And yet, for all that has been learned, the Denisovan story remains unfinished. This is one of the most important things to say at the end, because a good ending should not pretend to know more than the evidence allows. We still do not possess a full Denisovan portrait in the way many people would like. We do not have a rich gallery of complete skeletons showing how Denisovans varied across their entire range. We do not know the full map of their movements or the exact number of encounters they had with other populations. We do not know whether all Denisovan-related ancestry in modern populations came from one broad group or from several related populations spread across Asia. We do not know every environment they mastered, every tool tradition they used, or every way they differed from their close relatives. These gaps do not weaken the story. They are part of why it remains alive. Science does not end when certainty begins. Often it becomes more active once a discovery opens a better set of questions. Denisovans are a perfect example of this. Before they were recognized, the problem was invisibility. Once recognized, the problem became scale. How large was their world? How varied? How many fossils already found might belong within their wider history? How many more remain buried in caves, river deposits, or sediments not yet tested? A hidden lineage, once named, turns the whole field outward in search of its missing world. There is also the question of method. Ancient DNA has already transformed our understanding, but its possibilities are still growing. As techniques improve, it may become possible to recover useful information from remains once thought too degraded, from sediments without obvious bones, or from fossils long held in collections without their full significance understood. The Denisovan story encourages exactly that kind of patience. It tells researchers that the record may be richer than it looks, that hidden relationships can remain inside small and damaged materials, and that surprise is not a sign of failure, but of progress. At the same time, the fossil side of the story remains essential. Genes can reveal relatedness and admixture, but people lived with bodies, in landscapes, through climates, with tools, habits, shelters, injuries, and routines. To understand Denisovans as more than a genetic label, science still needs sites, objects, bones, and environmental evidence. That fuller picture may come slowly. It may arrive in fragments, as it has so far. But the Denisovan discovery has already guaranteed that such fragments will be read differently now. They will not be measured only against the old list of expected categories. The hidden lineage has changed the lens through which the whole field looks at Asia and at human prehistory more broadly. So the ending cannot be a sealed conclusion. It must remain open enough to match the evidence. A cave in Siberia gave us a doorway, not a final room. What lies beyond it is still being mapped. Yet even in this unfinished state, the Denisovan story has already changed something large and lasting. It has taught us that the human past can hold major presences without obvious faces. It has taught us that small fragments can carry enormous histories. And it has taught us that the story of who we are may always be less complete than we think, right up until the moment a buried piece of bone tells us otherwise. Perhaps that is the most beautiful part of this whole mystery. Human beings have always tried to understand where they come from. We build origin stories because they give shape to identity. Some are myths, some are historical, some are scientific, and most blend memory with imagination in one way or another. The Denisovan discovery belongs to the scientific side of that long effort, but it also touches something older and more universal. It reminds us that our past is larger than our explanations. The world that made us contained people we did not know to include. Some of them left only faint visible traces. Some left no names. Some left no stories that survived in words. And yet they were part of us all along. A skull fragment that should not have existed in the old map forced a better map to appear. DNA taken from ancient bone revealed a lineage that had once lived, adapted, and met other humans across a world much broader than the cave where it was first recognized. Those encounters changed the biological future. Their evidence still moves quietly through living bodies. The result is not a simpler origin story, but a deeper one. We do not come from a lonely line marching untouched through prehistory. We come from a human world of crossings. That should not make us feel lost. If anything, it should make the human story feel more alive. Complexity is not the enemy of meaning. In many cases, it is where meaning begins. The Denisovans make our past harder to summarize, but they also make it more honest. They show that the making of humanity involved presences beyond the ones our first confident diagrams could see. They show that disappearance can leave inheritance behind. They show that science, at its best, does not close mystery too quickly. It narrows it carefully, then lets the remaining unknowns stand. And somewhere beneath all the genetics, all the cave layers, all the arguments over classification and chronology, there remains a very simple image, a fragment of skull in cold earth, a bit of bone lying still through ages of weather, silence, animal movement, human absence, and geological patience. No one who first left it there could have imagined the world that would one day gather around it. No one could have guessed that tens of thousands of years later it would help redraw the history of our species. Yet the bone waited anyway. The record remained inside it anyway. The human story, larger than the stories told about it, remained ready to change. So this is where we end. Not with the feeling that everything has been solved, but with the sense that a door has been opened and cannot be shut again. Denisovans are no longer missing from the human family. They have altered the picture permanently. The family tree is less tidy now, the ancient world more crowded, the border between past and present less absolute. And if one hidden lineage could change human history this much, then it is worth wondering how many more quiet corrections still lie under stone, in forgotten collections, or inside genomes that have not yet been read closely enough. The past is not finished speaking. We have only become better at hearing it.